With us today, I'm delighted we have Annie Murphy-Paul. She has written most recently the book, The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside the Brain. Annie is an acclaimed science writer. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Scientific American. She's currently a fellow in New America's Learning Sciences Exchange. And I was fascinated by the idea of this book, and I won't explain it. We'll let Annie explain it. I think she's more qualified, and then we'll engage in a conversation with her. Annie, welcome to the Bregman Leadership Podcast.
Thank you, Peter. I'm so glad to be here.
So first of all, what I know that 20 years ago, Andy Clark, David Chalmers wrote this article, The Extended Mind, asking questions of where does the mind stop and the rest of the world begin. And what you write in your book is that they argue that that the brain does not stop at the standard demarcations of skin and skull. Rather, it's an extended system, a coupling of biological organisms and external resources. So your book, in a sense, if the mind extends to the world, your book, in a sense, is an extension of the paper that they wrote. Am I thinking about this correctly?
I think it is. Yes. Yeah. So when I first read that paper by the two philosophers you mentioned, Clark and Chalmers, it really struck me as being an amazingly transformative, big idea that could pull together all these strands of research that I'd been sort of collecting and following in my work as a science writer who focuses on learning and cognition. And yes, I did set out to write the book as a kind of well, as I say in the book, I wanted to operationalize the idea of the extended mind because, as you might expect from an idea that was proposed by two philosophers in an academic journal, it was this kind of high concept, like idea, ivory tower kind of idea, but it immediately seemed to me to have all these practical implications and applications. And so I set out to ask and answer the question, if the mind extends beyond the skull, if our thinking processes are spread across our bodies and physical spaces and our relationships with other people, what does that mean for the thinking that we do in everyday life? And how can we use that idea to improve the thinking that we do in everyday life?
So explain this idea of the extended mind.
Yeah, so Andy Clark, who really was the one who went on to elaborate on this idea, he says that the way we think about thinking right now, conventionally, traditionally, is brain bound. In other words, we imagine that thinking happens just inside the skull of one individual. And that really limits us because when we need to solve a hard problem or come up with an ingenious solution, really our only option is to work that brain harder and harder until it comes up with the answer we're looking for. And I think we've all found during the pandemic, when we've been kind of brains in front of screens for hours and hours a day, that's actually not the optimal way of thinking. There's so many other resources that can enrich and augment our thinking that unfortunately we've sometimes been cut off from during the pandemic, like interacting with other people and visiting new and stimulating places, and even feeling free to move our bodies or not just sort of sit there and work, which is, it turns out is not the best way to treat the brain. We actually want to help the brain out by bringing in all these external, outside the brain resources.
So there's so much I want to go into. So I want to go into this, but I do have, you brought up the pandemic and it made me just think, one of the things that I'm hearing and one of the arguments that employees offer to senior leadership when they're saying we don't want to go back to work, we want to, we don't want our commute. They're saying, hey, we've been more productive during the pandemic than ever. So in terms of our brains, the work of our brains translating into deliverables for the organizations, that has been by a lot of measures more productive than ever. So how is that so if our brains are suboptimized?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think that's been everyone's experience across the board, but you're right that absolutely that many people have found that without the commute, without all that goes into going into an office and being distracted in the office, that they're more productive. And I think that gets at another aspect of the extended mind, which is that the theory of the extended mind assumes that the biological brain on its own is actually quite limited. You know, we're always hearing about how amazing the brain is, how extraordinary, how it's the most complex object in the universe and all this stuff, which is true. But it's also true that the brain, the biological brain, is an evolved organ, you know, that evolved to do things very different from what we ask it to do today in terms of engaging with abstract concepts and symbols. And so it needs a lot of help to do the kinds of tasks that we expect of it in our modern world. And one of those limits that the biological brain has is to be distracted, especially by any kind of novelty or change in our environment, especially by social stimuli, anything to do with people. You know, our attention is just automatically going to gravitate to those things. And that's why the open office is such a terrible invention and such a hard place to get really any work done. So I think one thing that people are finding when they're working at home is actually predicted by the theory of the extended mind, which is we need space, we need walls, essentially to protect us from the limitations of our own brains. And I think that may be one reason why people are feeling more productive.
That's interesting, because the mind is extended, that we will be sort of less productive if we're distracted by a bunch of things. And so maybe productivity goes up, but things like innovation, which, you know, or collaboration, or things that, you know, the extended brain is advantages us in, those things probably end up going down.
Absolutely. And I go back to this concept that some psychologists have developed called intermittent collaboration. What they've found is that people who are working on their own all the time come up with a few really great ideas, and then a bunch of losers, because they're not bouncing their ideas off of other people. And then people who are in touch with their colleagues and interacting with their colleagues continually, they come up with ideas that are a bunch of ideas that are all kind of okay, you know, because we kind of sink to the lowest common denominator that everyone can agree on and achieve consensus on. It's those people who sort of oscillate between those two states, being alone sometimes, working alone sometimes, and then collaborating and communicating with other people, that come up with the best of both worlds. So I'm wondering if in this new world that we're developing as we speak, in terms of, you know, how we're figuring out how we work, if we can adopt that hybrid working style of working at home sometimes, coming into the office sometimes, to support that kind of intermittent collaboration, so that you have that kind of deep immersive work at home where you can work undistracted, but then you go into the office specifically to have those kinds of social interactions that are also important for thinking well.
There's a lot of talk about that. There's also talk about this hybrid model where you're working at home, there is no office, but, you know, once a quarter, maybe even once a month, you all get together at some fun place, you know, and you're collaborating, awesome. And you're thinking and you're meeting, but it's like, you know, you go to Mexico, you got to, like, it's still cheaper than, you know, having a huge headquarters somewhere, but you know, you're traveling to these different kind of fun. Let's have our meeting in Costa Rica, and we'll get together for 4 days and see what we can come up with. So, you know,
sounds good to me.
Something people are very excited about. Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's a question that I have, and I want to make sure we get into sort of the operationalizing piece of this, right? You talk a lot about how the mind interacts with its surroundings, with the body, with the environment. I wonder, like, how is that separation? I think you also say it's a false dichotomy, and I struggled with that notion, because, you know, you could say the mind is extended, or you could say the mind is impacted, right? And maybe they're the same things, but I think there's lots of ways in which, you know, what I love about this conversation is this is a deep spiritual conversation around like individuality and community and the ego and, you know, the communal, and, you know, am I an individual, or are we all connected? Like this is, you know, there's a profound conversation happening in this book. And I wonder where that line is of, like, actually the brain does, and the mind ends here, and the environment starts here. Right? Like there is a separation. It's not a false dichotomy, it's an actual dichotomy, and yet one impacts the other. Or is it truly a false dichotomy? And maybe even my question doesn't really make practical operationalized difference. But I found myself, kind of wondering about that.
Yeah. Well, I think the strongest case for saying that the mind is genuinely extended and not just discrete and then impacted on from the outside would be the part of the extended mind theory that has to do with embodied cognition, because it really is the case that thinking happens not only above the neck, not only in the brain, but the entire body contributes to the process of thinking. And I think that's something that scientists have been late to recognize, because there's such an entrenched belief in Western culture that mind and body are separate, that mind is elevated and cerebral and, the sort of crystalline sphere, and the body is grubby and animal and irrational and ungovernable, and has nothing to contribute to intelligent thought. We know that that's incorrect, that the body is intimately involved in everything that happens with our thinking processes. So I think there I'm on very safe ground.
Great. Yeah. So I'm gonna so we talked, you sort of talk about the body, the environment, and relationships. So I'm gonna give you that. Like I agree 100%. Like like our bodies think. And there is interesting, and I don't, we don't necessarily need to go into it. I haven't read any of the research about like our gut thinks, like we have microbiome and it's but let's just say like, there is this total false dichotomy between the brain and the body. How about the mind and the environment?
Yeah, well, here I like to think about the metaphors that animate the way we think about the brain. One of the most pervasive metaphors is the brain as computer. And it's interesting to me that we, humans invented the computer in the middle of the last century. And then we started analogizing ourselves to this thing that we had created, but the brain is actually quite different from computers. And one of the major differences is that while computers operate the same way, no matter where they are, humans and the human brain is really exquisitely sensitive to context. So we think differently depending on where we are. And as you say, I'm not sure it makes such a difference to pin down whether the mind is, thinking processes are happening out in our surroundings or whether they're simply affected by our surroundings, but they definitely are affected by our surroundings.
Got it. And and maybe the question is not the to your point, like, we could debate it, but it's an intellectual philosophical debate versus what does it mean for us, and should we be sitting at a desk or should we be walking in nature? And one more sort of philosophical question, which is, how do we know when to trust our minds? Like who's figuring out about the power of thinking outside the brain? Is that the brain? How does the brain actually extend? Like, how do we know about anything outside the brain if not the brain?
I've reported on psychology for 20 years now. And one lesson I've taken away from that is that we often don't know ourselves. We don't know what's best for ourselves. Things that we assume will work are often counterproductive. So that's why we have to, that's why I see the value of science and of evidence and empiricism. So to take that outside view of ourselves, I agree, is really hard to do. I don't know that I have an answer for that, except that the brain is, I don't ever want to seem to be suggesting that the brain isn't central to thinking. I just want to say that the brain doesn't do it on its own. The brain draws in these outside the brain resources to help it with its operation.
Right. Yeah. I've often wondered, as I sort of sit and I remember one of my first most self-aware moments when I was a kid was sitting there and realizing, oh my God, I'm a person. Like there have been I don't know, 120 something billion people in the world since existence, and I'm one of them.
Yeah.
And I can move my arms, and I'm having this conversation with you. Like I'm a person, and like, what does that mean? It's this very, I don't know. And then the next question, and I had this question when I was older. This was not a 6-year-old observation. This next one was, who's the I that's saying I am a person? Like, who's that I? Like, what, like, is that my mind? Is that like, who's asking the question? And who am I asking the question to? Like,
this is sounding like a Talking Head song.
yeah, exactly. But I think that, like your book raises these questions for me, because it's, it's fun to have a science book that is also asking these sort of, I think, deep philosophical questions, which is, existential. All right, let's go to the operational idea of the extended mind. Why don't you walk us through, you're talking about thinking with our bodies, thinking with our surroundings, thinking with our relationships. Why don't you, kind of talk about each one with, why don't you read your book from start to finish for us?
Yeah, right.
But why don't you talk us through each one a little bit, so that people have a sense as to what you mean by that? You've already talked a little bit about the body, and maybe a couple of things that we can do to enhance our connection with, the extended mind.
Sure.
Whoever our is.
Whatever that is. Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. So we do know that there is this thing called interoception, that scientists' word for what we would call, normal people would call, gut feelings. And I think this is one of the really practical takeaways from this research, is that the internal signals, that there's this constant flow of internal information being served up to us all the time, that actually we tend to actively suppress and push aside when we feel like we have to get something done. We have to power through and kind of override the body's signals. And that's a mistake, because the body is actually alerting us to this wealth of non-conscious information that we have stored in our minds, but we don't have conscious access to. It's actually the body with its internal signals that kind of taps us on the shoulder and says, hey, you've encountered this situation before, and this is how you're feeling about it, because this is how it went last time. And all of that is information that, if we're not attuned to our bodies and that internal world, then that we're missing out on. So
can I ask you just a quick question about that?
Yeah, sure.
I find that in psychology, one of the things that we often try to do, I say we, I'm not a psychologist, but one of the things that we often try to do is override that, meaning to say, I have always felt this way, I have this gut. It goes back to my question about what do you trust? And it's a pattern, and I need to break out of that pattern. Like, if I just go with my gut, then I'm going to stay in the pattern of the past. And what I want to do is break out of that. So I'm curious, like, how the mind interacts with that kind of a sort of disruptive, engagement with an extended mind that's being impacted by things. Yeah.
Well, it's certainly the case that our gut feeling, our interoceptive cues don't always steer us in the right direction. That's an argument for being more intentional about paying attention to what's going on inside. And I talk in the book about some tools for doing that, like engaging in a body scan practice, which is borrowed from mindfulness meditation, bringing non-judgmental, open-minded curiosity to whatever is arising from within.
And so just to be clear for people who don't know, so a body scan would be getting really quiet and start to feel what am I feeling in my feet? What am I feeling in my shins? What am I feeling? And just going through the body and feeling everything. And then you go, oh, that fear that I'm feeling about this next move, I actually feel it on my left side below my abdomen. Like and you could begin to disassociate actually a little bit from the feeling, as opposed to associate with it.
Yeah, you can gain a little bit of distance or detachment by being aware of it, rather than being fully identified with it. And another step in that direction is simply labeling it and giving it a name and saying, I'm feeling a tightness in my chest, and that actually does a lot to dial down our physiological arousal if we're feeling anxious or worked up. And simply labeling it, interestingly, has a really strong effect on the nervous system, just sort of calming us. So that's a benefit in itself. But then I also talk about tracking your interoceptive sensations and how they relate to the decisions you make and how those decisions turn out in something like an interoceptive journal, where you're actually kind of taking note of how you feel on the inside when you're making decisions, and then later matching that up with, you know, the decisions that you made and how they turned out, in the sense of kind of learning from what your body is telling you and when your body is steering you correctly and when your body might be kind of giving you false signals. But I think, you know, as I say, it's not something, the body signals aren't something to be followed in an uncritical way, but there's certainly something to pay attention to.
Right. And I mean, I imagine that unconscious bias concepts are all sitting in the body in many ways, like that, you know, that's part of the mind that we make decisions based on, you know, interoceptive responses to patterns we developed, you know, at a different time with different, you know, teachings kind of.
Right.
Okay,
absolutely.
Great. So let's go to the environment.
Yeah. So, you know, there's a couple of really big pieces there. One is time spent outdoors and in nature, and the enormous effect that can have on our attention, our ability to focus. And, you know, this, like gut feelings, this also struck me at first as a little bit like a little bit of superstition maybe, or like an old wives' tale, or kind of woo-woo, like, you know, go hug a tree kind of advice. But when as with interoception, when I came to understand the mechanism behind its effects on our mental state, it started to make a lot more sense to me. You know, the fact that we spend upwards of 90% of our time indoors or in cars is a really recent development, like, you know, in terms of the span of human history. Our ancestors spent all their time outside. We evolved in nature, and our brains process the kind of information that's available in nature, the kind of stimuli that we encounter in nature, really effortlessly and easily, without any kind of cognitive load, without any kind of strain. And so spending time in nature is this way of refilling the tank of our attentional resources, so to speak, so that when we return to our office or our workplace, we can we have all those attentional resources restored and refreshed, because they get drained really quickly inside and doing the kind of intense focused work that most of us do at work these days.
You know, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, like, even the way you're talking and we're thinking makes the assumption that the point of walking in nature is to enable us to come back to the desk and be productive and focused, and etc. And I want to question that, because I have that. I'm not putting that on you. Like, I was approaching this conversation with the same kind of focus, and I'm thinking, you know, given that the mind extends to the environment, there is value in and of itself to being in the environment and letting the mind stretch. And like that, like ultimately our productivity is just one piece of our experience of life as human beings on this planet. And now I'm getting woo-woo, but I think it's, you know, I think the people I know who are happiest are ones who have everything in perspective. And the walk in the woods, you know, what's her name? I have so many of her books here. Sylvia Boorstein. Boorstein, who's a Buddhist teacher, who tells this story of her grandfather going on walks. And she, when she was young, and she said to her grandfather, "What do you think about when you go on walks?" And he looked at her and he goes, I walk. Like, it's not about what I'm thinking about. Like, I'm not thinking when I'm walking, I'm walking, right? And it's this idea that, like, there's value. If the mind extends to the environment, then there's value to the mind being home in the environment, and whatever environment that is.
I think that's absolutely true. It reminds me of a fellow writer of mine, Scott Carney, whose book I'm reading right now. And he says in it, maybe the point of life is the experience of being alive. And I think the experience of being alive is something we encounter especially keenly and acutely when we're outside. And I do think it has something to do with the fact that it connects us to this ancient heritage of being human. I have to throw in just one more scientific factoid here, which is that the things that the brain processes really effortlessly and easily, it finds pleasant. We automatically kind of tag that with like a positive feeling. So that's another, and I'm not saying that's the reason to go outside, but of course it's something that all of us experience when we go outside, that it's sort of mood elevating, it feels good. And that's reason enough, I think, to step outside.
Okay, so let's talk about the third, which is relationships.
Yes. So this piece of the extended mind theory sort of takes on the cult of the lone genius that is so prominent in our culture. You know, the idea that great men have great ideas on their own, and looking at evidence that, especially in recent years, the information we encounter is so abundant. Expertise has become so specialized. Our problems and our challenges are so wickedly complex that one person is no longer, if they ever were, one mind is no longer adequate to solve these problems and attack these issues. What we need to do is think collectively and achieve a state of a kind of group mind. But that's not something that we're really taught to do. It can be a frustrating kind of enterprise, as any student asked to engage in a group project can attest, or lots of professionals who work on teams can attest.
Well, also, I want to include in this conversation I don't know why particularly. I mean, I think your book lends to it. I'm particularly philosophical in this conversation, but you look at the broader world, the divisiveness in which we're living, and you say, it actually seems like relationships are impacting the mind antagonistically as much as communally. Like we're right now in communities where two minds meet and they're not meeting. Like, they're fighting and then they go off and they separate.
Yes.
So I'm sort of curious about if you can weave that into how you.
Yeah. Well, I think the modern world offers increasingly few opportunities to engage in that kind of group mind, even as we need to be engaging that group mind more and more. For example, we spend more and more time online, of course, and there's research showing that we attribute less mind to the people the personage of people that we encounter online than someone we meet in the flesh. We think of them as less of a full-bodied person and more of a two-dimensional person, which makes sense. And then at the same time, as we're spending less time with people in person, we're also doing less of the things that our traditional institutions have led us to do. For example, engage in synchronous movement. If you think about churches or militaries or organizations where people move together in similar ways at similar times, that turns out to be this biological hack that allows people to feel like my body is moving in the same way at the same time. Maybe I'm sort of, not so separate from these other people. I'm kind of with them or like them. And that allows people to think together and cooperate together more easily. But we don't often have those kinds of experiences in modern life.
There's these Japanese corporate practices where everybody's outside and they're they're doing the same movement all together. Or you think of a yoga class, or you think of Tai Chi, or everybody's doing these like same movements in the same way. That's so interesting. And in our American individualist society, we're antagonistic to that idea. Like, no, if you're moving that way, I'm going to move differently.
Right. We're so anti-conformity, and but actually, and this is something that turns up in the research and in accounts from history and people's personal lives all the time. There's a kind of ecstatic feeling and a joyfulness that people get from joining a bigger group, and that's also something that we're missing out on in our commitment to individualism.
What are other ways? I'm very interested in this relationship piece, because I think one of the biggest challenges to to life is that sense of feeling alone, right? And the sense that we feel like people don't understand us, or we're and I think that's why we sort of, Facebook feeds tend to gravitate towards telling you the information you want to hear, because it's like, oh, I'm not alone. What are other ways that we can extend our minds to each other in a way that helps us to feel that we're not alone, even maybe with people that we disagree with?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of value in thinking routines that involve our social brains and our social selves. And this is another kind of cultural bias that I want to take on in this book, which is that somehow social life and intellectual life are separate and even opposed. Like you engage your brain at work, but then maybe you'll go out for a drink after work. We treat them as separate and distinct.
Right.
But human beings are fundamentally social, and we're social all the time. That doesn't get turned off just because we're at school or in the office. And so I think the more we can incorporate social activities like storytelling and debating and arguing and teaching other people, the more we can leverage those in the service of thinking, the more we harness this innate human power that we're kind of leaving on the table right now because we think of social life as kind of frivolous.
I'm curious. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious about other ways that to me, I'm thinking rituals. Like I think of I'm Jewish, and I think of Shabbat dinners, Friday night dinners that we have, and we're saying the same prayers and we're eating together. Like the rituals that, whether people are Jewish or not, who are part of our community, come over for Shabbat dinner, we all participate in that same ritual.
Right.
And it absolutely, like I'm seeing now, and it's sort of why you say with kids, to give them rituals and routine, and that's sort of a safety. And I realize how that is part of the extended mind of social fabric connection. I'm curious of I'm sort of fascinated. I'm holding on to this concept a little bit because it feels really important in these times.
Yeah.
Some other ways to get that, to extend the mind to each other socially.
Yeah. Well, so psychologists talk about this concept they call entativity, which is like, how much does a group of people feel like an entity unto itself? And another word they use for, entativity is a little bit of a mouthful. So they also talk about groupiness, like how do you get a sense of groupiness? How do you evoke that in a group of individuals? And some of the ways that groupiness can be created are just what you said, engaging in rituals together, engaging in synchronous movement together, and even eating together is a kind of synchronous movement. You're all kind of, making the same motions at the same time. Having emotional experiences together, which again was traditionally a big part of people's lives in churches and other kinds of organizations, but lots of us don't have that experience anymore. Even in movie theaters, we're like streaming a movie at home alone, interestingly, back to that question of that matter of rituals, it turns out that sharing meals together, and not surprisingly, is an especially powerful way of creating bonds among people. My favorite little factoid here is that research has found that when people eat family style, like sharing from the same dishes, that effect is emphasized. And when people eat very spicy food, their physiology is activated. You actually your heart beats a little faster. You might sweat a little bit. It's actually a physical experience of arousal that's like what I was saying about having an emotional experience together. So, I think everybody should be eating family style, really spicy food. I think that would bring us together.
I find myself thinking about Peloton, and I wonder whether it might be spread out across the world. So you're not physically connected in any way, but you're all in the same class at the same time. I'm curious if does that affect, I don't know if you've studied this or if you looked at the research around this, but does that affect reach to, synchronous, non-geographically located synchronicity? And then an even harder question is, I do, exercise videos at home, and those are, they're asynchronous, right? I mean, it's like the video's already been recorded a long time ago. I'm not doing it at the same time. Does that actually extend the mind from a relationship perspective, perceptually?
Yeah, well, we are so, as I was saying, so fundamentally social that we can project and imagine a kind of social relationship, in lots of situations. I even think of that sometimes when I'm, doing the dishes and I turn on NPR. There's the reason I want to do that. The reason I want to, beyond wanting to know the news, is I want to hear a human voice. That's actually a kind
Right.
of social connection, and that it just speaks to how very deep and fundamental that need is.
So I could actually be watching a video working out and actually fall in love with my trainer who I've never seen before. And that's like an actual like impact on my mind. That's very interesting. um, I am curious about, and we're going to be wrapping up here, although I don't really want to. But I'm curious about how you wrote. So I think about writing a book, right? And I've written a bunch of books, and it's a very like there's lots of ways in which my mind is thinking and reaching out, but it's also a very unextended mind process in some ways. Like I'm sitting here, I'm at my computer, I'm writing, and I'm curious how your writing process was impacted by what you're writing about, by your understanding of the extended mind. And did you find that you were in a conversation with this idea of the extended mind, and did it impact how you wrote this book?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, very much so. There was that meta conversation going on all throughout writing this book, which was a big, ambitious project because I was drawing from a bunch of different disciplines, so many studies, so many interviews. And I say in the book, I don't think I could have pulled it off if not for what I learned during the process of writing the book.
And it is, I think, the way you just even described that, it is very much something where you can get lost in an unextended mind. Like, okay, I've got 150 research papers I've got to look through, and I've got to straighten this, and I've got to keep everything in my mind at the same time, and I've got to sort things out. So
yes.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I always say that writers write what they need to learn themselves or teach themselves. And I started this project as a very brain-bound person. I've been a freelance writer for many years. I work mostly in a solitary way, and I'm in my head a lot, but I was really persuaded by what I was reading about in all this research on the extended mind. So I did apply it, and I found it really useful. One of the most transformative ideas that I encountered was this idea of cognitive offloading, that we do too much inside our heads, and it's actually much more efficient and effective to offload the contents of our minds onto physical space, whether that's a big whiteboard or a multi-monitor setup, with your computer, or my own favorite Post-it notes, which you can move around and manipulate almost as if they're physical objects. And then if you have a big enough space, you're actually kind of physically navigating through it, like as if it's a 3D landscape. So you're bringing in all these embodied resources that remain dormant if it's all just like up here in your head.
Interesting. I was going to wrap up with that question, but I do have another question. And I don't know if you've done any research with this, but my son, I just bought for my son, he really wanted it, and we're playing with it, an Oculus, right? Which is like a virtual reality headset. And I wonder if like that literally is extending the mind into nothingness, but I really have, I pick up a gun, I really think I'm shooting someone, or slashing a cube as it's going by me. And I'm curious of the, like what the relationship is. Like everything you're talking about is reality. And I guess like what we talked about with Peloton is sort of a virtual reality also. I'm curious if the virtual reality helps to ignite the extension of the brain.
Yes, there's so many potentially fruitful connections between the theory of the extended mind and virtual reality. And I've actually, since the book came out, I've heard from a lot of people who are working in VR. But just to give you one example, we were talking earlier about how implicit bias really resides in the body, and virtual reality offers an opportunity to correct or work with bias, in the sense that in virtual reality, you can embody a person of a different race. You can feel that your body has a different skin color. And it turns out that we're so attached to our own bodies, we have such positive feelings about ourselves, that as soon as we perceive that we're another race or another gender, or someone who's differently abled, or has, or even someone who's there's interesting research that people can be made to feel short, on a virtual reality subway, and then they have more kind of tall people have more empathetic feelings towards short people once they've actually embodied a short person.
Wow, that's So that's really the relationship with the body. That's the felt experience, like extending your mind to a body and giving you an opportunity to experience. That's so interesting.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah. No, just that we're limited in the sense that we're only in real life, we only occupy one body. And so we only have that one perspective, but virtual reality opens it up such that we could have the embodied experience of being all different kinds of people. And what could that do in terms of changing our relationship to other kinds of people?
Right. Fascinating.
Yeah.
We have been talking with Annie Murphy-Paul. Her book is The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside the Brain. Annie, it's such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for being on the Bregman Leadership Podcast.
Oh, thank you, Peter. I loved your questions. This has been a great conversation. Thank you.